The wind carried a hollow whisper across the hollowed streets of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, in the late autumn of 1873. 8 children vanished from the orphanage of Saint Damaris in a single night. Windows remained unbroken, doors bolted from the inside. The caretaker, old Father Bryce, claimed he heard only the echo of footsteps beneath the floorboards, but neighbors whispered that something far older had claimed the children. Those who lived near the orphanage described a strange cadence to the night. A low, rhythmic chant bleeding from the walls, sometimes melodic, sometimes a guttural hiss that set teeth on edge. Families nearby reported nightmares of shadowed figures, tall and indistinct, moving behind the foggy glass panes of their windows, watching. The town's children spoke of seeing the vanished kids wandering the forests, their faces blank, mouths open in silent screams. Newspapers dismissed the disappearances as tragic yet mundane. Yet the entries in the orphanage's ledger told another story. Names crossed out without explanation, dates scribbled in unfamiliar ink. Bryce's journal, found decades later in the walls of the chapel, hinted at ritual, sacrifice, and a hierarchy that extended far beyond Millhaven. It spoke of a covenant, ancient and binding, enforced with a devotion so absolute that questioning it invited oblivion. This is the story the town refused to remember. It is the story never spoken aloud, of institutions cloaked in piety yet corrupted at the marrow. Every whispered detail points to a truth too horrific to face, buried beneath centuries of ritual, obedience, and fear. And yet, the echoes linger, stretching through the forest, across the town, into the very bones of those who dared live near Saint Damaris. Inside Saint Damaris, the ledger grew heavier with each passing month, though no new children were officially admitted. The ink, black and viscous, sometimes seemed to smear on its own, leaving words indecipherable. Father Bryce wrote of the chosen and the night of unseeing, phrases that reeked of something older than the institution itself. Parishioners whispered that the orphanage was a vessel, its corridors tuned to a frequency between life and something else entirely. Visitors reported an odor that clung to the hallways, a mix of damp earth, decayed paper, and something faintly metallic, like blood long dried. At night, the halls exhaled cold breaths that smelled faintly of rot and lavender, confusing and sinister. Children reported hearing voices through the walls, half chant, half cry, and some began sleepwalking to hidden rooms beneath the chapel. By 1874, rumors spread of a secret society connected to Saint Damaris, one that recruited from seminaries and churches far beyond Millhaven. Scholars who later stumbled across references in local papers described a hierarchy built on absolute obedience, and a doctrine that equated devotion with terror. Those who attempted to investigate often disappeared themselves, leaving only notes in jagged, panicked handwriting about doors that should not exist and eyes that wait beneath the woodwork. The ledger itself became a symbol of suppressed knowledge. Its pages chronicled births, deaths, and disappearances with the meticulousness of a census, but with one chilling distinction. Names crossed out seemed to vanish from memory. Families swore they could no longer recall their own children, and historians who attempted to trace the missing often hit dead ends, records deliberately erased or burned. It was here that the pattern of Millhaven's darkness began to emerge, a deliberate orchestration of erasure, ritual, and institutional control. Beneath the pious veneer, something unspeakable was thriving, and the ledger's black ink was only the beginning. Behind the orphanage lay a forest so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground. Townsfolk called it the Whisperwood, and for decades they avoided it. Children claimed that voices rose from the trees, soft and coaxing, calling them deeper, promising games they could not refuse. The vanished children, neighbors swore, sometimes appeared at the forest's edge, staring blankly before disappearing into the shadows. Father Bryce recorded that the forest was consecrated, though not by God, but by a presence older, patient, and indifferent. At night, the trees seemed to shift, roots curling like serpents beneath the moss, and branches scratching in patterns that resembled letters, names, or runes. Those who entered without purpose were rumored to return altered. Eyes wider, skin colder, speech slower, as if the forest had consumed their will. Local hunters spoke of figures between the trees. Not human but not entirely animal, tall, thin, always just beyond clear sight. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, yet deliberate, as if guided by an unseen choreography. And in the coldest mornings, frost would appear in shapes that resembled footprints, circling in impossible geometry around broken stumps and hollow logs. Occasionally, townspeople found strange artifacts at the forest's edge. Tiny dolls, carved from bone or wood, faces painted in muted despair. Small cages holding nothing but the echo of a scream. Some suspected these were warnings, signs of ritualistic practice meant to remind the town of boundaries that should not be crossed. Others believed they were memorials, or perhaps trophies, cataloging the forest's victims. Whisperwood became more than a place. It was a living extension of Saint Damaris corruption, a dark labyrinth that mirrored the institution's obsessive secrecy. To traverse it was to glimpse the suppressed, to hear the world's underlying terror in a language that should have remained forgotten. A dozen years after the disappearances, Saint Damaris' surviving children began to form a choir. On Sundays, their voices would rise, sweet and angelic on the surface. But those attuned to subtler frequencies noticed something else. An undercurrent of dissonance, a resonance that carried the weight of unnamed suffering. Visitors reported chills, nausea, and an inexplicable pressure in their chests during these performances. Some swore the songs contained hidden names, whispered in reverse or in tones too low for normal hearing, echoing through the rafters like a spectral ledger. Clergy who attempted to analyze the phenomenon confessed that the choir seemed to sing the unseen, recording histories the town had buried. The children themselves seemed altered by the music. Their eyes occasionally rolled back, voices trembling into falsettos that no human throat could sustain. Sleepwalking and trances became common, as though each note carried them closer to another dimension. Researchers decades later noted correlations with occult rituals in similar institutions across the eastern seaboard, though most dismissed them as coincidences. It was suggested in Bryce's long-forgotten notes that the choir was a medium, a bridge between Saint Damaris and something older, something that had always existed beneath Millhaven's foundation. The music was both prayer and invocation, blending innocence with terror, devotion with compulsion. Families of the children became unsettled, reporting that even at home, the melodies echoed faintly in empty rooms, summoning memories that never existed. The choir's legacy would haunt Millhaven for generations, a haunting proof that the institution's reach extended far beyond bricks, walls, or morality. The voices of the children, whether alive or transformed into something else, persisted, singing a ledger of suffering that could not be unlearned. Years after Saint Damaris fell into ruin, rumors persisted of a hidden chamber beneath the orphanage. The cellar, long sealed with iron bars and mortar, was whispered to contain symbols scratched into walls. Triangles, circles, inverted crosses, and sigils unknown to modern scholars. Townspeople avoided the area, claiming the air itself felt heavier, saturated with the residue of ritual and fear. Investigators who forced entry described a smell of wet earth and iron, cold that seeped through clothing and bone, and shadows that seemed to stretch along the walls even without light. The floor was uneven, carved in a geometric pattern that seemed almost organic, pulsating faintly under torchlight. Ancient furnishings, covered in dust, bore scratches and stains, records of acts long concealed. Most chillingly, the walls seemed to hum, a low, imperceptible vibration that resonated with the chest, producing nausea, vertigo, and an inexplicable sense of guilt. Father Bryce's notes hinted at this chamber as the epicenter of Saint Damaris' secret, a space where obedience was tested, where children disappeared, and where the very concept of morality was rewritten. Clergy who entered reported visions, fleeting glimpses of children trapped in glass cases or levitating, their eyes wide and silent. Some later recanted under duress, refusing to speak again, as if even naming the chamber invited disaster. The town attempted to seal the chamber permanently, pouring concrete over its entrance, but locals swear that whispers still emerge during stormy nights, or that faint torchlight flickers beneath the soil, suggesting the chamber exists in some other plane, immune to physical closure. It became clear. The building was never just wood and brick. It was a vessel, a locus of ritualistic obsession that outlived the people who had constructed it, echoing centuries of trauma and unspeakable acts. Documents unearthed decades later revealed Saint Damaris' ties to a seminary in Massachusetts. Letters between the orphanage and the seminary discussed methods of moral reinforcement, the language chilling in its clinical detachment. Requests for children to be transferred, for observation, were noted, and the seminary's headmaster assured compliance, noting that disobedience could be corrected with divine rigor. These letters hinted at a network of institutions dedicated not only to piety but to experimentation on obedience, fear, and submission. Children were systematically placed in environments designed to manipulate every sense: light, sound, temperature, and touch. Some were removed from their beds at night, subjected to isolation or ritualized punishment, often returning with blank expressions or murmuring in unfamiliar languages. Clerical correspondence spoke of a great design, a covenant binding the seminary, Saint Damaris, and others in an unspoken hierarchy. Names were occasionally coded, sometimes replaced by initials, suggesting that some individuals existed only as functional units within the system rather than as people. The language was deliberate, cold, and efficient, as though the letters themselves had been drafted to hide horrors in plain sight. The psychological impact on the children was profound. Survivors described recurring visions, sounds that no one else could hear, and the sensation of being watched by eyes that belonged neither to man nor beast. The seminary's curriculum included esoteric texts, some drawn from folklore, some from cryptic moral treatises, all intended to enforce compliance through fear. Through these connections, it became evident that Saint Damaris was not an isolated corruption. It was part of a broader architecture of power and control, where institutional authority masked something far more ancient, persistent, and insidious than anyone had imagined. Among the few surviving personal records, Eleanor Voss's diary stood out. Eleanor, admitted to Saint Damaris at age 7, wrote with precision and care, chronicling her days in pencil-stained pages. Early entries describe routine life, lessons, chores, prayers, but the tone shifts around the time the first disappearances occurred. She described the watching, subtle but ever-present, shadows that lingered, corners of the room that seemed to breathe, and a low humming she could feel vibrating through her bones. Eleanor's writing becomes increasingly fragmented, reflecting her descent into terror and dissociation. She records seeing other children disappear in moments of stillness, only to reappear days later, altered, silent, and haunted. One entry chillingly reads, "They take the ones who dream too loudly. They take the ones who speak when the walls whisper. I hear them now, but I must not write their names." Later pages contain strange sketches, labyrinthine corridors, figures with elongated limbs, and faint circles resembling the sigils found in the hidden chamber. Among the few surviving personal records, Eleanor Voss's diary stood out. Eleanor, admitted to Saint Damaris at age 7, wrote with precision and care, chronicling her days in pencil-stained pages. Early entries describe routine life, lessons, chores, prayers, but the tone shifts around the time the first disappearances occurred. She described the watching, subtle but ever-present, shadows that lingered, corners of the room that seemed to breathe, and a low humming she could feel vibrating through her bones. Eleanor's writing becomes increasingly fragmented, reflecting her descent into terror and dissociation. She records seeing other children disappear in moments of stillness, only to reappear days later, altered, silent, and haunted. One entry chillingly reads, "They take the ones who dream too loudly. They take the ones who speak when the walls whisper. I hear them now, but I must not write their names." Later pages contain strange sketches, labyrinthine corridors, figures with elongated limbs, and faint circles resembling the sigils found in the hidden chamber. Eleanor's diary also hints at forbidden rituals conducted under the guise of instruction. They call it obedience, but it is blood and cold. I think the chapel watches me as I sleep. Her final pages are torn, leaving a trail of fear without closure. Local historians speculate she may have fled or been taken, but no record confirms either outcome. The citizens of Millhaven rarely spoke of Saint Damaris after its closure. Official records minimized the disappearances, erasing names and events from public memory. Yet, every town has its ghosts, and in Millhaven, the ghosts were persistent, insistent, and silent. Local legends claimed that those who lingered near the orphanage experienced strange lapses in memory. Entire days missing, neighbors' faces unrecognized, and fleeting images of children in windows that no longer existed. Families reported hearing faint chants in the dead of night, even when the building had long since crumbled. Dogs refused to enter the ruins, and birds avoided the vicinity entirely. Psychologists later examined patterns of trauma among descendants of Millhaven residents. Many exhibited inherited anxiety, nightmares, and irrational phobias, suggesting that the collective fear of Saint Damaris had seeped into family lines, forming a latent, inherited terror. Some theorized that trauma, when reinforced over decades by silence, could manifest almost as if it were a tangible entity. Even in death, Saint Damaris exerted its influence. Graves nearby occasionally bore symbols that could not be identified, etched into stone with remarkable precision. Stories emerged of townsfolk hearing whispers beneath freshly turned soil, or footsteps echoing in abandoned streets. The town's amnesia was not accidental. A carefully maintained facade of normalcy concealed the institution's corruption, allowing generations to live unaware while the orphanage's legacy continued to haunt them. The truth, though buried, refused to be silent, whispering insistently to those brave or unfortunate enough to listen. Some families in Millhaven carried the burden of Saint Damaris quietly, their stories muffled by fear and shame. Letters discovered in attics decades later revealed parents pleading for their children's release, only to be met with cold, bureaucratic responses. Some children were never returned. Others came back, altered in ways no parent could understand. Survivors described their homes becoming extensions of the orphanage's terror. Hallways felt longer, shadows lingered, and rooms whispered names that were not spoken aloud. Meals were skipped in silence. Laughter became rare. Even the sunlight seemed tempered, filtered through the residue of fear that had seeped from Saint Damaris into the town itself. Local folklore tells of the weeping families, descendants who, generations later, were drawn inexplicably to the ruins. They would wander the crumbling walls, muttering fragments of forgotten prayers and occasionally collapsing into sudden, inexplicable grief. Psychologists have theorized that trauma, when unacknowledged and amplified by community-wide silence, can persist across generations, imprinting memories that feel real despite never having been consciously experienced. In some accounts, these families spoke of shadowed figures in the periphery of vision, small children dressed in ragged clothing, always watching, always waiting. Their presence was never threatening in a physical sense, but profoundly unsettling, like a reminder that the past refuses to remain buried. The forgotten families, caught between memory and erasure, embodied the invisible toll of Saint Damaris. Their lives were a testament to suppressed truths, showing that terror is not always sudden. It can be patient, slow, and insidious, infecting generations with the unrelenting weight of unseen horror. At the heart of Saint Damaris stood a chapel unlike any other, its stained glass depicting not saints, but faces, blank, watching, observing. Parishioners noted the unnerving sensation of being stared at during services, though no one in the pews made eye contact. Some claimed the eyes shifted subtly, following movement, a silent accusation embedded in colored glass. Central to Saint Damaris' unspoken doctrine was the ritual of silence, described in Bryce's fragmented notes. Children were gathered in the hidden chamber, instructed not to speak for days, sometimes weeks. Those who broke the silence were subjected to punishment, often through sensory deprivation or exposure to terrifying stimuli, until compliance became instinctual. The ritual was not merely disciplinary. It was formative. Isolation, fear, and observation rewired the psyche, embedding obedience and erasure into the very identity of the children. Sleepwalking, hallucinations, and dissociative episodes became common, and those who endured the ritual too long emerged as hollow vessels, capable of performing without question or thought. Accounts from neighbors describe seeing children moving mechanically through the forest, eyes glazed, whispering phrases no one could understand. It became evident that Saint Damaris sought to remove individuality entirely, replacing it with a version of humanity that could witness horror without resistance. Psychologists today might identify the effects as extreme conditioning, but within the context of Saint Damaris, these practices were ritualistic, almost sacred. The silence was both a tool and a symbol, a covenant between the orphanage, its enforcers, and the ancient forces Bryce alluded to. Breaking the silence, in any sense, threatened not only the individual but the integrity of the system itself. The ritual of silence stands as a testament to the terrifying potential of institutions when devotion to obedience surpasses empathy, showing how spaces, authority, and ritual can coalesce to erode the human spirit completely. The belfry of Saint Damaris towered over Millhaven, a silent sentinel during the day and a dark silhouette at night. Children spoke of climbing its spiral staircases, only to find themselves disoriented, as if the structure itself had shifted. Some claimed to see shadows moving along the rafters, figures that mirrored human form but elongated unnaturally, sometimes disappearing when approached. The bell, unused for decades, emitted occasional, unprovoked chimes. Townsfolk reported hearing it toll at midnight, though no one ascended the stairs, and the rope remained untouched. Some described the sound as hollow, resonating with a tone that made stomachs churn and hearts beat irregularly. Bryce's notes hinted at the belfry as a point of observation, a place from which the unseen watched not only the children but the town itself. Instruments of control were embedded in the architecture. Creaking floorboards, hollow spaces, and vantage points that allowed for monitoring, feeding the orphanage's obsessive need to catalog and dominate. The belfry became a symbol of omnipresent surveillance and authority. Its shadows, real or imagined, were extensions of the institution's psychological reach, and those who looked upward felt both awe and dread. It embodied the enduring legacy of Saint Damaris, the idea that even empty structures could exert control, perpetuate fear, and haunt generations with memories they could barely recall. In 1921, a young historian named Jonathan Hale stumbled upon the remnants of Saint Damaris records in the Millhaven archives. Many documents were deliberately defaced, but what remained told a story of ritualized terror and methodical observation. Hale's notes reveal his growing dread. Each page I turn, I feel watched. Each name I read, I feel the weight of what they endured. He uncovered letters between the orphanage and distant seminaries, coded entries listing children by initials, ages, and compliance scores. Some pages contained maps of hidden corridors and chambers, etched with symbols resembling runes or sigils. Hale reported dreams in which he wandered the orphanage's halls, hearing the whispers of children long vanished. Locals cautioned Hale to abandon his investigation, warning that curiosity could invite consequences. But Hale persisted, driven by academic ambition, until he vanished without explanation. Only his notes remained, bound in a leather journal, marked with scratches and stains that hinted at violence, and his final entry: "Do not open the ledger. It remembers." Hale's disappearance cemented the story of Saint Damaris in regional folklore, a cautionary tale of knowledge too dangerous to uncover. The archives themselves, a place of supposed scholarship and rationality, had become a repository of fear. By the mid-1930s, the orphanage lay abandoned, yet Millhaven residents still reported sounds emanating from its walls. Footsteps in empty hallways, doors creaking open, and faint laughter that chilled the blood. Explorers who dared enter spoke of hallways stretching beyond architectural logic, corridors folding back on themselves, and shadows moving independently of light. Some described seeing children walking the halls in slow, trance-like states, stopping suddenly as if sensing an invisible observer. Attempts to touch them failed, the figures would vanish, leaving only cold air and the faint scent of damp earth. It became apparent that Saint Damaris architecture itself was a trap, designed to disorient, to instill fear, and to perpetuate trauma. The building had become an active participant in its horrors, a vessel of psychological manipulation. Orphans who survived Saint Damaris' regime carried its terror for life. Adults recalled fragmented memories, nights locked in cells, voices whispering from walls, and rituals where they were compelled to kneel or chant without understanding. Many reported dreams of corridors, of being observed, and of shadowy figures beckoning them. Some of these survivors attempted to speak publicly, but the community largely silenced them. Letters to authorities were ignored, therapy non-existent. Trauma, amplified by enforced silence, became a generational inheritance. Families of these orphans often experienced anxiety, hallucinations, and nightmares without apparent cause. Research uncovered evidence of a secret society connecting Saint Damaris, the seminary, and several churches across Pennsylvania and New England. Their aim: to cultivate obedience and channel fear through ritualized control. Members used coded language, shared forbidden texts, and orchestrated disappearances to maintain power. The society's reach extended beyond the physical, influencing townsfolk psychologically. Entire communities conformed to silence, memory was erased, and unspoken rules dictated behavior, ensuring complicity without conscious acknowledgement. Father Bryce's journals suggested a covenant older than Millhaven itself. The institution, and perhaps the surrounding land, were bound to an ancient entity, one that fed on fear, ritual, and obedience. Symbols in the hidden chamber, the chapel, and the belfry hinted at celestial or preternatural alignment. Those who encountered evidence of the covenant reported a sense of vertigo, nausea, and a compulsion to obey, as if the very ground carried instructions. The covenant's power was subtle, insidious, and absolute, suggesting that the horrors of Saint Damaris were only a fragment of a deeper, enduring corruption. Stories persisted of a recurring night, decades after the initial disappearances, when shadows moved independently and children vanished once more. Witnesses described spectral figures carrying children into the forest, chanting in incomprehensible tongues. Those who attempted to intervene often fell unconscious, waking to find no trace of what they had seen. The night became legend, a reminder that Saint Damaris' influence transcended time, that the institution's rituals persisted beyond its physical existence, and that certain horrors were cyclical, inexorable, and inescapable. By the 1940s, Millhaven had changed, but the orphanage's shadow endured. Structures fell, families dispersed, yet the psychic residue remained. Children avoided certain streets, adults experienced inexplicable dread, and local legends of whispering walls persisted. Psychologists later termed such phenomena residual trauma, but folklore suggested a more active force, one that could manipulate perception, memory, and fear across generations. Saint Damaris had not only consumed children, it had become a living entity of terror, encoded in memory, architecture, and ritual. Today, all that remains of Saint Damaris are fragments. Ruins, old ledgers, diaries, and whispered tales. Yet the ledger's legacy endures. It is said that anyone who reads the entries feels observed, compelled, and unsettled. Names may vanish from memory, yet the ledger remembers. The true horror is not merely historical. It is a reminder that institutions, under the guise of care and piety, can cultivate terror and perpetuate trauma. That suppressed knowledge, when unearthed, carries consequences beyond comprehension. Saint Damaris' story is a warning that some secrets are deliberately hidden for a reason, and some darkness refuses to die.